Lovers of lore, thank you for joining me for the 5th installment of the Brothers War storyline. And much like with the Time Stream Chronicles, you are going to notice a difference with this video as we are returning to a traditional style of storytelling from the earlier days of this channel. That being said, in the previous video, we left off with Urza eyeing the Thran tome and declaring to Rusko that he was going to win the hand of the fair maiden Kayla and claim that dowry. Now, Rusko was excited about the prospect of this romance right up until Urza turned to him and said, I need your help with this project, specifically in regards to acquiring particular items I'm going to need, and these will have a significant cost. At which point, Rusko somewhat wilted. He kind of mulled it over. Okay, Urza needs metal, he needs iron root wood. Maybe I can give you a loan, right, against a few years worth of your salary. And Urza nodded at this, but ultimately asked Rusko, have you heard of ornithopters? And Rusko was kind of offhandedly not paying attention to that because he's tallying up the amount of money he might lose in this over time and trying to figure out how he's going to work this to his advantage when it slowly clicks into his mind that, wait a minute, why is Urza here talking about ornithopters? So he just looks over and, wait a minute, do you know something about ornithopters? At which point Urza says, yeah, actually, I helped to build the first ones, so I can offer you schematics in exchange for your assistance here. And at that point, Rusko's attitude completely shifts. Being the greedy fat little fiend that he is, he gets big dollar signs in his eyes. So he immediately agrees to fund whatever Urza requires, pulls out a big old sack of gold, and basically runs out the door to go and get parchment and quills so that Urza can start to sketch out the ornithopter documentation for him. Urza spent the entire night drawing out perfect diagrams of the ornithopter. Rusko was genuinely floored when he realized that this gifted mind, Urza, had been working in his clock shop, just fixing clocks as an apprentice. This incredible mind just essentially almost rotting away here in obscurity. The documentation that Urza provided to Rusko was so good that any idiot could build an ornithopter from it. So with Rusko's full enthusiasm and cash behind him, Urza was able to get all of the different required ingredients to put together his newest creation. Now, it wasn't a thing of beauty because ultimately, Rusko, being the penny pincher that he was, had kind of cheaped out in some ways on the materials, and as a result, the creature that Urza had put together out of iron root wood and metal was kind of a strange, gangly beast. It had strange long arms, and his head was basically a helmet that had been slapped on, with a power stone fragment located in the center of it. Ultimately, this strange construct took Urza over 2 months of work to build. Because Rusko wasn't aware of Su-Chi design, he had no idea that Urza had intentionally designed this construct to have its knees bend backwards. Late one night during the construct's creation, Rusko turned to Urza and abruptly asked, "Who is Mishra?" Urza stopped working on the construct and his shoulders sagged. Rusko felt some regret immediately, as he had seen how much joy Urza was getting from working on this construct and had absolutely no idea what bringing up that name would mean. After a long sigh, Urza looked at Rusko. "How do you know of Mishra?" Rusko told him that he talks in his sleep, and not just of Mishra, someone called Tak'Kasia too. Urza looked at Rusko. "Tak'Kasia was my teacher. She's dead now." Rusko looked somber and asked, "And what about Mishra?" Urza looked at Rusko bleakly. "I don't know what's happened to him." And at this point, something happens that really makes Rusko a lot more likable as a person, because he sees that Urza is struggling. And he explains that in Yosha, they have a belief that people have many souls, and you wear the different souls throughout your life. And Urza really wasn't understanding what Rusko was trying to say at first, so he explained it in another way. He said, "You don't wear the same clothes that you did when you were a child. You don't wear the same clothes when you're older as well that you're wearing now. It works the same way with souls. You have one soul as a child, another as a youth, and many as an adult." Urza looked skeptical, but Rusko assured Urza, "Many souls mean many chances. You may feel guilty now, but you shouldn't. A new soul was birthed when you arrived here, a Yoshin soul." Urza stepped away from Rusko. It was clear his mind wouldn't be at ease until he was able to speak with Mishra again. Urza then pulled the chain that held the power stone out from under his tunic and climbed a stepladder up towards the top of the construct. Flipping back the front of the helmet, he took the power stone and he touched it to the little fragment that was nestled inside the helmet. The glow from Urza's power stone flowed into the power stone fragment inside the construct, bringing the stone to life. Urza smiled as he stepped down off the ladder. The machine has a new soul as well. All the while Urza had been working on this construct, the competition for Kayla's hand had been ongoing. By the time that Urza was able to compete, it had already been going for 3 months, and Kayla was very bored already. It was essentially just an endless procession of muscle men, and they all failed to impress her in any way. She couldn't stand the thought of marrying any of them, so instead her mind just wandered to the various injuries that they all ended up getting. Mostly it was pulled muscles, some people pushed themselves to the point of exhaustion and collapsed, and there was even one idiot who tried to headbutt the jade statue, and he got hauled off with a head injury. So it was at the end of the 3rd month of this competition where all the other competitors had had their chance, and the only ones left were Rusko, Urza, and the giant towering construct, which was covered in a massive cloak, so it just looked like a huge hulking man. Urza spoke to the warlord's assistant, who relayed to the warlord that they had an unusual candidate who had asked if it would be alright to move the statue with the strength of their mind. The warlord gave a curt nod, but also warned against wasting his time. Urza stepped forward and with a flourish, he pulled the cloak off of his construct. The crowd mostly just snickered. The construct was ungainly and unimpressive aside from its size. Its movements were slow and clunky, and it required that Urza be there to constantly talk to it, issuing a non-stop stream of commands. But ultimately, he did make it all the way across the courtyard to the jade statue. The silence of the construct lifting up the jade statue was a big counterpoint to the noise that all of these muscle men had made, trying to heave and strain lifting it up into the air. Under Urza's watchful eye, the construct grasped the base of the jade statue and lifted it into the air. At this point, it rotated on its hips, so its knees were now facing forward. Unfortunately, the combined weight of the construct and the statue together were too much for the paving stones in the courtyard, so they started to get pummeled down into dust, and this threatened to make the construct fall over to its side. It almost did, but Urza was there barking commands at it, and he was able to get it to right itself, and eventually get fully across the courtyard, where it set the jade statue down triumphantly. At this point, Urza and the construct had won over the crowd, and they cheered loudly. Even Kayla stood up and clapped delightedly. The warlord, however, was furious. His face was a thundercloud as he stormed off. Kayla followed meekly after him, but she did look over at the last moment to see Urza standing there beaming with a giant smile on his face. Back in the keep, the warlord was raging. He called Urza a bunch of different names. How dare that weed try and trick me? The warlord seneschal was nervous. He interjected, "You did say that Kayla would marry whoever moved the statue, and you also did allow him to compete after he said that he was going to move it using his mind. This just enraged the warlord further, and he started bellowing, "That machine did it!" The seneschal remained bland. Kayla could marry the machine. At that point, the warlord completely lost it and chased the seneschal out of his presence. After that, he turned to Kayla and said, "What are your thoughts on this, daughter?" Now it was Kayla's turn to lose it. Me? I had no say in any of this. You want a way out of the corner that you've put yourself into. You were perfectly happy to hand me off as a prized pig to one of those giant oafs, and now that you've been beaten at your own game by somebody who's more clever than you want me to undo it. Well, I won't. At this point, the anger drained out of the warlord and his shoulders slumped forward, and he kind of mumbled about how much he loved his daughter and just wants the best for her, and this weed is not the best. Kayla countered back that she likes Urza. He's smart and good looking. The conversation was interrupted at this point when the seneschal returned. "My lord, you have a visitor requesting an audience with you." The warlord waved it away. "I don't want to see the weed." The seneschal bowed and said, "It's his sponsor, my lord." The warlord looked annoyed, but ultimately allowed the seneschal to usher Rusko into his presence. Rusko, true to form, being the obsequious little fat man, bowed 3 times on his way up to the warlord. And you could see the annoyance on the warlord's face every single bow. Along with this came a steady flow of words from Rusko's mouth. "Your Grace, Your Highness, Conqueror of the Sword Marches, Bearer of Prosperity, Master of our Fates." The warlord waved an annoyed hand and Rusko cut off. "I assume you bring me a message from the weed." Rusko explained that he actually had 2 different messages. The first was indeed from Urza. Urza was saying that he would accept the warlord's decision if he was turned down, but he would ultimately be disappointed to not win the hand of the lovely Kayla. The warlord just grunted in annoyance in response to this and said, "And the second message?" Rusko was a little flustered by his curtness, but he swiftly drew the ornithopter plans out from under his coat and handed them over to the seneschal. "My message is this, my lord." The seneschal handed the blueprints over to the warlord. The warlord looked over the blueprints and then looked up at Rusko. "These flying machines work?" Rusko gave a half shrug. "Well, the construct did." The warlord mused for a moment and said, "Perhaps this weed may have more secrets locked away in that mind of his?" To which Rusko came back with, "Argivians are so closed off by nature, and I've been around Urza for a while, and I think the only thing that will really bring him out of his shell and get him to divulge his secrets is the love of the right woman." The warlord took Rusko's bait and looked up at Kayla. "You would be all right, daughter, marrying this talented weed?" Kayla smiled at her father. "Honestly, he's the best candidate we've had so far." To which the warlord stood up, dusted off his hands, and said, "Let us go congratulate my new son-in-law." The wedding was absolutely ridiculous. What you need to understand is that Krug had dozens of major temples and hundreds of smaller ones, and the priests from all of these places wanted input on the actual wedding ceremony. So you have a situation where over 100 priests were involved. If you thought a regular wedding was boring, just imagine this. This is the most boring wedding in the multiverse. Sermon after sermon, you've got prayers, then you've got spirits being banished, people invoking gods, more sermons, more prayers, dancing around fires, kissing religious icons, touching scriptures, freeing doves, burning scrolls of religious rites, walking under upright blades. They were given blessings, they were given benedictions, and all of this craziness was all from Kayla's side because she's the royalty of Krug. But Urza is from Argivian society, which is far simpler, right? So from Urza's heritage side, all they brought in were golden circlets on each of their brows joined together by a silver chain. And then after everything they had already been through, There was a parade that lasted for hours that flowed all throughout the city. After that, an endless feast with non-stop toasts from anyone and everyone who felt like speaking in front of the assembled people. Finally, in the late hours of the night, they were officially completely married, and Urza had been bestowed the title Chief Artificer of Krug. Throughout the entirety of the ceremony, Kayla had been bored and annoyed, but she had hid it well. Her father did not hide things so well, and the warlord was chafing from the first hour of the event. But Urza, on the other hand, was completely at ease for the entirety of the event, showing not a sign of anything but interest. Kayla was really impressed with the way he handled the day. At around 2 in the morning, they were finally alone in their bridal chambers, silken sheets with rose petals. They sat together on the bed, and Urza looked Kayla in the eyes and said, "There's something that I have to tell you." His serious tone made Kayla feel very worried. Urza went on to explain that he talks in his sleep, and Kayla heaved a big sigh of relief. "Don't worry, husband. I'm a very good listener." And then they melted into each other's arms. Before daybreak, Urza rose and went to the pile of treasure that was his dowry. Reverently, he lifted the Thran tome, set it on his desk, and then he turned and looked at Kayla for an eternity. With a contented smile, he turned and lifted the cover of the tome and started reading. Now, while Urza's lot in life had improved considerably since he had left Acacia's camp, on the other side of the coin, things were very bad for Mishra. The exact same morning that Urza was sitting down to read the Thran tome, Mishra was getting kicked in the ribs to wake him up. There was no fine bed and lovely wife for him. He slept on the ground. He was a slave now. He had been dreaming of his power stone, but it had been taken from him by the Philagi, the desert dwellers. They had called him Rakik, the Philagi word for slave. When Mishra had fled out into the desert, he was able to find just enough water to survive from the meager plant life out there. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to find any food. So when the Sawardi raiders happened upon him, he had absolutely no strength to fight back against them. And sadly, at first when they arrived, he thought they were friends from the original camp come to save him. But that illusion was quickly shattered when they roughed him up, took his power stone, tied him up, and dragged him back to their camp. Things had gotten very grim out in the desert, and now any outlanders found out in the sand had their lives taken from them. Those lucky enough to survive had their lives used up in forced labor. Any other desert people that were captured would be ransomed off, but any outlander that was taken slave would be worked until they died. Mishra had seen half a dozen people come and go. Some of them were there before he arrived, some of them came after him, but at a certain point, the Philagi raiders stopped bringing in new prisoners to the point where he was the only outlander slave left, and he knew his days were numbered. He had learned to ask nothing. Watching another slave have their teeth chiseled out for asking questions was a very strong lesson. So he spent his time digging pits. Occasionally, he would stumble across a remnant of the Thran society, but in his numb state, it meant nothing to him and he cast it aside. He was beaten down and his mind focused only on obeying to survive, so he didn't even notice when a voice called out to him. It took 3 attempts before Mishra realized that someone was yelling to get his attention, and he turned around fearfully, expecting to be beaten. But it turned out to be Hajar from the old days back at Acacia's camp. Mishra just stared at him. Hajar looked at Mishra. "Are you okay?" All Mishra could do was nod. He was afraid that the time he was spending away from digging would mean he'd get a savage beating afterwards. And true to his fears, the slave master came running on up. He was a jealous man now that most of the slaves had been taken away from him. Mishra was the last outlander he had left. He yelled at Hajar, "Keep away from the Rakik!" Hajar laughed. "Do you know who you have digging ditches for you?" The slave master made a dismissive snort. This is a scholar of ancient secrets you have here. The slave master just clipped back. No wonder he sucks at digging ditches. Hajar, obviously annoyed at this point, says he shouldn't be digging these ditches. And the slave master says, I agree with you. He's supposed to already be dead. If you don't like it, see the Kadir. Hajar gave him a curt nod. I'll do just that. Try not to kill him before I come back. Inside, Mishra was terrified. He knew that the slave master was going to be livid. Regardless of the fact that Mishra was working as hard as he could, the taskmaster still beat him mercilessly. Mishra had even tried to speak up during the exchange to say, I love digging holes. It's the only thing that I want to do. Please let me do it. Later that night, his body racked with pain, eating moldy bread that wasn't even fit for the dogs, golden-clad soldiers came for him. The men in the golden armor were the Kadir's royal guards, and they had arrived to take Mishra away. When they explained this to the taskmaster, he was very unhappy, but ultimately there was nothing he could do. So the guards grabbed Mishra and half marched, half dragged him to the Kadir's tent, where they unceremoniously threw him into a very rich but dirty looking tent. It was very clear that the Kadir had once been a giant powerful warrior, but now, as a result of his success, he was running more to fat. Mishra also noticed that Hajar was there, but he didn't have any time to think about that as he immediately fell to his knees. The Kadir looked him up and down and then turned to Hajar. This is the scholar you were talking about? He doesn't look like much to me. And Mishra, apparently not having all of the spirit beaten out of him, quietly muttered in perfect philology, do you judge your horses by their bridles or by how hard they serve? It was barely a whisper, but the room went dead quiet, and the Kadir shot an angry look at Hajar, who wilted. It looks like he speaks our language too. Hajar looked at the Kadir sheepishly. I did say he was a scholar. The Kadir grunted and looked back at Mishra. Do you know of the old ones? I know of the Thran. And what of languages? Do you know of Argive, Corliss, Yoshin? Mishra responded, they are all actually the same, with just mild differences. After also testing his math skills, the Kadir deemed Mishra to be an acceptable tutor. The plan was to have him tutor the Kadir's son in both language and math. Success would be rewarded greatly, but failure would lead to a torturous death. Mishra didn't know it at the time, but the Kadir's son had been in attendance this entire time and was both oblivious and very bored. This boredom would prove to be a big problem for both Mishra and Hajar, as now Hajar's fate was intertwined with Mishra's. Because Hajar was the one who suggested Mishra be the tutor, if Mishra failed, that would also reflect poorly on Hajar and he would share Mishra's fate. On top of the concerns about shared failure was the fact that the boy also detested teachers, and even more so Outlander teachers. Mishra was despondent. He knew he was going to be sent back to digging. But Hajar knew better. Previous tutors were all gone without a trace. The boy would sleep through his lessons, and if Mishra had the gall to try and awaken him, the boy would have his guards beat Mishra savagely. After lamenting about this to Hajar, Hajar asked, why did you want to learn philology? And Mishra responded, I'm interested in people. Ancient stories of the philology are fascinating. Genies, the Makfawa, it's all better in the original tongue. So Hajar suggested, why don't you do the same thing with Outlander legends? You can teach the boy that way. And also, why don't you teach him to swear in Argivian as well for good measure? This actually turned out to be a great solution, and as the month passed, Hajar was able to relax. At this point, things were far enough along that even if Mishra was deemed a failure, it was very unlikely that Hajar would also be dishonored by the situation. The Kadir's son was learning well, Mishra, as a result, had less work to do as the boy wanted to be told stories and continue his education. At this point, things were relatively good. And then one night, Hajar was summoned deep into the darkness to meet with the Qadir. The Qadir stated that the Rakik tutor has done well, but at the same time the Qadir was troubled because his son had started to ask about a special gemstone. So the Qadir had had that gemstone pulled out of the treasury, and he held it out in front of him and said, "What do you know of this, Hajar?" Hajar responded, "It is an eye of the old ones, Qadir." The Qadir just grunted, "But why does my son want it? And why does it still glow when it's broken? Other eyes lose their light in these circumstances. Was my son going to try and give this to the Rakik? They're getting too friendly. My boy is too dependent on this crutch. Will he be ready to stand on his own by the end of next year?" Hajar's mind was racing because at this point he knew that the Qadir's son was better educated than most of the residents of the encampment. But if he spoke up, that would probably be the end for Mishra. So instead, he went ahead and agreed with the Qadir and said, "Yes, most likely by the end of next year, your child will be prepared to lead." The Qadir smiled, "Good, because when he's ready, it will be time to cast this crutch aside." Hajar knew what that meant. Mishra would quietly disappear, slain in the night deep in the desert as Hajar watched on, carrying out the Qadir's orders. He decided to keep it to himself. Perhaps the boy would go on raids, and after gaining some martial experience, he would have less interest in these scholarly teachings, and then quickly forget about Mishra. And maybe if the boy forgot about Mishra, then the Qadir would as well. Elsewhere in the same camp, Mishra was trapped in his own nightmare. The stone sung to him in his sleep. It was the real reason that he never tried to escape. The stone was an anchor holding him in this place. In his dream, he was in a metal land. Oil rained down upon him, and before him there was a gigantic metal pyramid in the middle of a gigantic metallic forest. The entrance had that familiar green glow, and Mishra knew that's where he needed to head next. As he took his first steps, a massive being emerged. A gigantic dragon engine reared up, and Mishra panicked and bolted towards the door of the pyramid. The brass dragon let out a metallic screech as it lumbered after Mishra. He knew with that dream logic, if he could just reach the top of this incredibly long set of stairs and grasp the green gemstone in his hand, he would be safe. As he ran, he could hear the dragon engine gaining on him, getting closer and closer, and he felt like he was moving slower and slower until miraculously he felt his fingers brush against the gemstone and he clasped it into his hand. He expected to feel metallic jaws tearing into his body, but instead when he turned around, he saw that the dragon was laying down on the stairs like a pet. It was his now. A voice came from nowhere. Mishra spun around. Up on a ledge, the black-skinned being from his earlier dreams stood. Mishra held the stone up towards the being, but he could feel that this one was different, too strong to dominate in this fashion. The being leapt down off the ledge, screaming, "Give me the stone!" And Mishra pulled the stone in towards himself, grasping it as tight as he could in his hand. The demonic being reaching out and grabbing onto his hand and tearing both the stone and Mishra's arm away from his body. Mishra awoke from his nightmare screaming, the tent guards nearby looking in with complete disinterest. Mishra stared down at his arm. There were giant ragged rents in his arm that looked like claw marks, but in his hand, no stone. He sighed sadly. Then the ground started to rumble. A little bit at first, but then the intensity started to grow, like an earthquake. The goats and horses started to get unruly and freak out. Tents started to collapse as the animals bolted away. And then the dragon engine from Mishra's nightmare burst forth from the earth here in reality. Its brass body glinted fiendishly in the moonlight. It came up in the center of camp, near where the Qadir's tent was located. Soldiers gathered to face off against it, but they stood no chance, their weapons bouncing harmlessly off the dragon's metallic hide. Hajar knew instantly from time spent in Takesha's camp that Mishra was the right person to get in this situation, so he dashed off looking for him. It wasn't long before he located Mishra, curled up in a ball, his eyes welded shut, whimpering over and over, "The dream! The dream!" Hajar switched to Argivian. "Snap out of it. How do we defeat this device?" This actually worked to pull Mishra back to reality, reminding him that they were indeed dealing with a device. So he looked at Hajar. "I need the power stone." Hajar already knew the location of the stone, so he grimly said to Mishra, "The Qadir has your stone." They spotted a green glow off in the distance. It was the Qadir leading the main mass of his troops against the dragon engine. There was a sound like desert wind, and the dragon engine opened its jaws, letting forth a massive blast of red steam. It instantaneously cooked the Qadir and all of his troops, their flesh falling from the bones. Hajar leapt into action, dashing over to where the Qadir had fallen and retrieving the power stone from amongst his smoldering bones. At that point, Hajar made the mistake of looking up into the dragon engine's eyes and realizing that it actually had a malevolent sentience and knew exactly what he was trying to do, and that he did not have the power to use the stone itself. So the dragon reared up to chase after him while Hajar dashed off towards Mishra. As Hajar is running, he can hear the sound, that desert wind building up behind him, and he knows he's about to be enveloped by that devilish steam. So diving sideways, he tosses the power stone towards Mishra and covers his head as he bumps down into the ground with a grunt. He waited a moment and then looked up, expecting to see his own doom descending upon him. But instead, the dragon engine sat before Mishra like a dog, steam still flowing up out of its mouth. Hajar stood up and dusted himself off. "Is it dead?" Mishra gave him a half smile. "No, it's under my control, I think." At this point, the Qadir's son arrived, learns that his father has passed on and he is in charge, and instantaneously the mantle of leadership descends upon him and his face hardens. The young Qadir turned to Mishra. "Can anyone but you control this beast?" Mishra said, "I don't know yet. We can test that." The new Qadir nodded. "Take this thing out into the desert while we tally up our losses here." Mishra dropped to his knees and said, "I am ever your slave, wise one." The young Qadir smiled down at Mishra. "Rise, you are no longer my slave. You are now my personal wizard." So now the story jumps ahead a few years, and we're actually following Tanos on his journey to become Urza's apprentice. Now Tanos is just a young man at this point. He's a big, tall, brawny boy. He's from a little fishing village called Jorlin, and he has an impressive knack for toy making. So as a result, he has a letter of introduction that he's going to take to Urza so that Urza will take him on board. So he arrives at the Palace of Artifice, which is the grandiose name for the wing of the warlord's palace that Urza works out of. Now, there were no guards at this part of the palace. There were tons of people flowing in and out, scribes, assistants, and so at first, Tanos didn't even really know where to go. So he just started to follow the flow of people, trying to find someone that he could give this letter of introduction to. But he just kept bumping into more students in the massive mill of people. So ultimately, he makes his way into the heart of the palace, and that is where he finds Urza, the chief artificer. Now Urza is constantly in motion here. He's scrawling notes, he's yelling about measurements to different groups of assistants and students, and Tanos honestly couldn't figure out how he was even going to introduce himself. He looked around the room at all of this madness, and he only spotted one still figure. Standing off to the side with a slightly impatient look on her face was Kayla. Tanos wasn't aware that he was looking at Urza's wife, He just saw someone who might be able to help him get his letter of introduction into the right hands. So he hurried over to her and introduced himself. Kayla smiled at Tanos and explained that in the lair of the chief artificer, there was no ceremony. So it was going to be pretty difficult to get that letter of introduction into Urza's hands. He was constantly busy. In fact, Kayla explained that what she normally did was show up at his workstation, and if he did not address her within 15 minutes of her being there, she would leave. And she said at this point right now when Tanos walked in, she was already at the 10-minute mark. And from the way things looked, Urza had no signs of slowing down. This made Tanos antsy, and he wanted to know, when will Master Urza be free? Should I come back later? Kayla snorted, he's never less busy than this. If you're his new apprentice, then I wish you good luck, because most of them don't last more than a month. Tanos looked agonized, and Kayla decided to try and help him. So she called out to Urza, but all she got in response was him raising his hand in her direction. Kayla just ended up looking annoyed, but Tanos reached into his cloak and pulled out a tiny little snake, which he casually tossed over on the desk that Urza was working on. The snake uncoiled and started to slither through all the paperwork that was arrayed on the table, ultimately coming up right in front of Urza and opening its mouth, displaying its little metallic fangs. Everyone in the workshop froze. Even Urza stopped writing. He took his stylus and he tapped the snake on the tip of its nose. When he did that, the snake immediately curled up into a little ball. Urza's face split into a big smile and he looked up around the assembled people. Who did this? Who is responsible for this? Tanos took a hesitant step forward. I did it. Kayla stepped in. He says that he's a toy maker from Geographic. She never got to finish. Urza immediately seized on the phrase toy maker. You make toys. Why did you make the snake out of wood? Tanos explained that the wood was lighter and more flexible. Urza nodded in approval. So you tried metal. Excellent. I take it you actually studied wildlife to make this? Tanos was starting to become less shy as he explained that he actually spent time studying coastal vipers to design the toy. Urza's enthusiasm overwhelmed the boy. Have you ever studied birds? I'm trying to improve on ornithopter's lift. Tanos forgot all about being nervous and dived in entirely. Well, soaring types would be no good. What you want is a bird of prey style for the wing designs. Urza's smile grew wider. I had not considered that possibility. The conversation went on this way for some time, and by the time Tanos was done talking to Urza, Kayla was long gone. And you have to feel for Kayla at this point. She genuinely felt abandoned, right? Yes, she is married to Urza, but Urza is spending all of his time working on devices. And her father is constantly asking Urza for new devices, and these devices are enriching the kingdom. The effect that Urza's inventions had were widespread and impressive. The common people liked Urza at first for marrying Kayla. And then after a while, the nobility warmed up to Urza as well when they realized that he had no political inclinations and just wanted to tinker away making his constructs. The temples were the biggest sticking point because, first of all, Argivians are not religious by nature, so he had no ties to the temples. And on top of that, if you recall earlier in the story, Urza was actually turned away by all of these temples when he applied to work there as a scholar. So what happened with the temples? They were waiting for Urza to either slip up or to do something that impeded or trampled upon the rights of the temples, and then they would try and pull him down. But what happened instead was Urza came up with an invention that made the leaders of all of these religious temples fall in love with him. He invented what came to be known as the amulets of Krug. Using a little sliver of power stone, he was able to create amulets that would emit a calming hum. And at the same time, they also offered a little bit of protective magic. The clerics of the temples snapped these up immediately and started to proclaim what a good person Urza was. And that furthered his reputation with the common folk. So Urza was beloved in Krug. Everyone was happy but Kayla. Her father was pressing her to have a child because he needed an heir, but he was also demanding all of Urza's time with his need for constant new inventions for this noble or this disaster. So Kayla filled her time with matters of state. And on the same day that Tanos arrived to become Urza's apprentice, a massively important meeting took place with Kayla, the warlord, Rusko, and other important individuals in attendance. Over time, Rusko had wormed his way into a position of importance. Originally, when he showed up, he was part of Urza's entourage, and he still partially held that role as a go-between, kind of keeping tabs on what was going on with Urza, but he had also moved in as a go-between liaison for the multiple guilds and the warlord's palace. So he had a considerable amount of power now, and you could see it in the way that he acted. He's no longer this obsequious, fawning individual, kind of tripping over himself when dealing with these higher level individuals. And in one way, it was more fun when Rusko was like that, but in another way, he's going to be a catalyst for a big part of what happens next in the story, right? It really does change the way that you will view this character. So this important meeting was being held to discuss the Falaji raiders. The desert dwellers had become more and more of a problem for the warlord of Krug. They were raiding supply caravans. They were also demanding exorbitant tolls to pass through their land, and it was becoming intolerable. So they were devising a way to end this threat to their population and finances. The warlord's first question was, why don't we just use ornithopter patrols? The problem with that turned out to be that while they had enough resources in terms of manpower and the building materials, they lacked the one crucial thing that allowed ornithopters to fly, and that were the ancient Thran power stones, which they had no capability to manufacture and had very limited supply of in Yosha. Urza had been working on fixing some broken power stones that they had found, but that resulted in only a few more ornithopters available and certainly wouldn't be enough for their needs. This aggravated the warlord, so he decided what they were going to do was send scouts out into the desert to look for power stones themselves. But there was a catch with that. It was pointed out that the Argivians also are out in the desert searching for these power stones, and if they were to be encountered, then a skirmish between the two kingdoms might happen. The warlord decided to send a letter to the king of Argive explaining that they would be out in the desert searching for power stones and that they both shared a common enemy, and this was for their mutual defense. That part of the conversation handled, Rusko brought new matters to the table. The warlord of Krug had instructed everyone to keep their eyes out for any sort of new invention that might be of use to him. So Rusko pulled out a little vial of black powder, poured it out on the table, and set it on fire. It burned and hissed and bubbled in a very strange way. The warlord looked unimpressed and mildly disgusted. Why have you brought goblin powder to my table? Rusko countered back, I prefer the term dwarven fire black, and I believe this could be of use to us. The warlord waved it away. We've tried using that stuff before. It's volatile and completely unreliable. What will we even do with it? So Rusko asked, have you ever considered dropping it from a height? The warlord again just looked unimpressed. If I drop it from the top of a wall, it's just going to destroy the base of that wall. What would even be the point of that? That's when a fiendish glint entered Rusko's eyes, and he said, but what if it was dropped from an ornithopter and you were out of reach? The realization of what Rusko was suggesting slammed into the warlord with massive force. He looked up stunned. Mishra had been busy too over the last few years. The Sawardi had taken the dragon engine and used it to subdue all of the other clans. At first, the Qadir had a number of different soldiers try taking the stone from Mishra and controlling the dragon engine, but every time they did, as soon as the stone left Mishra's hand, the dragon engine went berserk. So it didn't take long before they decided to just leave the stone ultimately with Mishra and stop those attempts altogether. So they traveled around the desert to each of the individual clans, bending them under the Qadir's thumb. In most cases, the tribes were happy to join up, but a few did put up a struggle that did not last very long. And by the time they had unified all of the desert tribes under the Qadir, Mishra was able to control the dragon engine with simple thoughts and gestures instead of having to use the Power Stone. At this point, the Qadir decided it was time to turn to richer prospects, so they decided to take down the city of Tomakul. Now, this was a merchant city, so they actually surrendered without a fight. As long as the Qadir agreed to let them continue life as usual, they would offer him tribute and everything would go on as it had. The people of Tomakul did not want any disruption because they were part of a major trade route, and you could see it reflected in the population there. They had Sardian dwarves, seafaring minotaurs, holy men from far-off Gix, and even some of the familiar zebra-hide capes of Zegon. And speaking of Zegon, that was actually the next city that the Qadir set his eyes on. But unfortunately, they ran into a peculiar problem. The dragon engine, when it reached about a half a mile outside the city, refused to move any further. It wasn't that the dragon engine had broken down, and it wasn't that Mishra had lost control of it. It just, for some reason, refused to come any closer to the city. They ended up circling all the way around the city, and regardless of where they were, the dragon engine would proceed no further. Now, at this point, the new Qadir threw a tantrum. He had, over the years, become a fat, spoiled brat and was ultimately a tyrant now. He was petulant because he wanted the dragon engine to loom over the denizens of Zegon, the same way it had over Tomakul, and he was not happy about the situation. So they sent a demand into the city for them to surrender and received a response from the city saying that they would think about it. All this served to do was enrage the Qadir further, so he decided that they were going to leave Zegon for now and travel to the outlying smaller cities and villages and level them, so that panicked survivors would flood into the capital city, ultimately causing chaos and fear. After that decision was made, Mishra headed back to his tent, which was now located on the outskirts of the encampment on the off chance that his nightmares summoned up more dragon engines. When Mishra and Hajar arrived at his tent, they realized someone was already there. And when Mishra stepped inside, there was a red-haired, beautiful woman waiting for him. Hajar recoiled a bit because in the desert, red hair like that is an evil omen. The woman introduced herself as Ashnod and said that she had been sent to negotiate on behalf of the rulers of Zegon. She demanded that Mishra send Hajar away, and Mishra nodded to Hajar that he should go. Ashnod and Mishra settled down to have a conversation when abruptly Ashnod got an annoyed look on her face and reached down under the chair she was sitting in. She drew forth a long black thunderwood staff adorned with copper wires and a dolphin skull at the very tip. She pointed it at one side of Mishra's tent, and from Mishra's view, he saw nothing emit from the end of the staff, but abruptly he heard a loud yell, and Hajar fell into view. Apparently, he had been hanging right outside of the tent flap and was just blasted with whatever magic energy had just issued forth from Ashnod's staff. Mishra checked on Hajar, but all Hajar could do was chatter his teeth and say, "So cold." Mishra realized that Hajar ultimately was going to be fine, and at the end of the day, he did tell Hajar to leave, and he stuck around. So Mishra didn't really feel that bad about what happened to him and went back into the tent with Ashnod. Mishra looked speculatively at Ashnod's staff. "So that's how you stopped my dragon engine." The soldiers of Zegon had all been armed with staves of this nature. Ashnod explained that her device worked specifically on nerves. "Your dragon engine is incredible, but living bodies are the best machines." They had only been in each other's presence for a few minutes, but they were already getting along quite well. Mishra explained that Zegon was going to have to surrender, open its gates, and also pay the additional price of having their premier artificer taken hostage in retaliation for them standing up against the Qadir. Ashnod smirked at that. Hostage? Wouldn't assistant be better? Mishra looked at her. Is that the real reason you're here? It turns out that it was. Ultimately, Ashnod wanted to become Mishra's apprentice. Mishra gladly accepts the proposition and becomes her mentor and more. The story continues back in Krug, where more time has passed. Urza, whose hair is turned white from the stress of constantly working, spends most of his time with Tanos at this point. The warlord of Krug is having a very unsuccessful time rooting out the Philology out in the desert. There's no real way to pin down exactly where they're going to be because they can move their homes so quickly. As a result, he came up with a plan to try and unite all of the coastal nations, Yosha, Krug, and Corlys together. And with that unified front, they would enter into peace talks with the Philology. Kayla had attended all these meetings where the peace talks were discussed, and ultimately she felt like there was some undercurrent to the meetings that she didn't understand, and she felt that it posed some danger to her husband. So she actually went and approached Urza and tried to explain to him that she thought something was going on. But unfortunately for her, she wasn't really able to get the threat that she felt across to Urza because she wasn't sure exactly what the issue was. So ultimately, Urza just believes they're going to be having peace talks and endorses the concept, leaving Kayla foundering with no real way to express her genuine concerns. An invitation was sent out to the Kadir of the Philology, and safe conduct was promised. To make this all work, the warlord of Krug offered the city of Corlys 2 ornithopters. Now, the Argivians already had some crude ornithopters from back when Urza was living out in the desert, but the citizens of Corlys, they're the only part of the coastal nations that doesn't have access to ornithopters, and they desperately want them. And because ornithopters are being sent as a gift to the people of Corlys, Urza harumphed and insisted that he be sent along so that he could ensure that the citizens of Corlys knew how to operate and maintain the devices. He didn't even realize at first that he had been tricked into going. So the preparations were made, and the warlord's retinue, including Rusko and the giant metal man, headed off to prepare for the meeting. Urza spent the next week getting the ornithopters ready. They would fly a dozen over and leave 2 for the people of Corlys. Urza planned for a 5-day trip to get there, but ultimately, due to good weather and also the proper placement of base camps along the route, they were able to make good time, and the trip only took 4 days. Rusko had set up a number of base camps along the route to the meeting place, and these were well stocked. They allowed the pilots a place to both rest and eat. The only real problem with these camps were that crowds of spectators showed up, because they wanted to catch a glimpse of Chief Artificer Urza and his wondrous flying machines. Now, unfortunately, this made it very difficult to land the ornithopters, and there was no real way to communicate with the crowds that had gathered. So what they were forced to do was to actually have one of the ornithopters kind of do a diving swoop, and that would scatter the crowd so the rest of the ornithopters could land. And one of the pilots that actually came along with Urza was overheard likening the situation to herding sheep. And that actually upset Urza to the point where that pilot was demoted and he had to spend the rest of the trip at the back of the flight of ornithopters, and he didn't say another thing for the entire trip. Even after they had landed the ornithopters, the crowds would still pose a problem for Urza in terms of people swarming him and begging for rides in the ornithopter. At first, Urza said no, but once the group of pilots that were with him volunteered to take the small children that were around up on flights, he begrudgingly accepted under the condition that he would not be giving rides himself and his personal ornithopter would be off limits. The pilots that had come along with Urza were all hand-selected by Rusko, and they were mostly hot dogs and daredevils known for pushing their ornithopters to the limit and in a lot of cases surviving crashes that should have ended their lives. Urza would have chosen less reckless pilots if it were up to him, but he wasn't too worried because they were properly trained. The meeting was to take place where the river core met the shielded sea. There was a strip of terrain considered no man's land. A huge field was cleared, and a giant pavilion was erected in the middle of it for the leaders to all meet in. Arrayed around it in 4 different sections were specific areas set up for the 4 different nations. You had on the west the warlord and his Yotians. To the south you had Corlys. Off to the east you had the Argivians, and to the north was the spot for the Philologi. Now, when Urza finally did arrive, everyone had already assembled there aside from the Philologi. They had not shown up yet. Each country had brought its own honor guard. Yosha had the most troops, Argive had the most ornate armor, and Corlys had the best equipment, which makes sense considering that Corlys was a merchant city that was equipping mercenaries instead of having their own city guard. Urza settled in and learned that his giant metal man had had a bit of an accident on the journey over, and its ankle was all busted up. So Urza spent the night and part of the next day fixing it up so it would be ready in time for the opening ceremony. Unfortunately, on day 1 after the opening ceremony, there was no appearance of the Philologi. Day 2 was much the same, except tensions started to rise, specifically amongst the citizens of Corlys. Different members of competing guilds were fighting over who would be in charge of the ornithopters. Additionally, the warlord was getting into arguments with the Argivians over power stones. Day 3 was different. Mists rolled in, and when they rolled out, the Philologi were just there. Their tents were all placed, and no one had seen them arrive. There were a lot of desert dwellers. There were twice as many of them as any other of the groups that had arrived here. And they had the giant brass dragon engine with them as well. The Qadir's honor procession made its way to the main pavilion. Urza was watching the procession intently. He noted the fat Qadir and quickly dismissed him. There was a man in jade green robes that drew his eye. Alongside him, a beautiful woman with hair like flame. It took a moment for the realization to hit him. Urza was stunned. It was Mishra! Urza watched him speak with the Qadir. It seemed like he was getting instructions. Sure enough, Mishra stepped up and greeted the assembled leaders. He spoke of how they had had a long journey, and that they would need rest, and that they would meet again, and thanked them for their indulgence. At that, the Qadir's procession turned to leave, but Urza took a step forward and yelled out, "Brother!" The warlord looked annoyed at first, until Rusko whispered something into his ear and the warlord nodded back. At the same time, there was an excited buzz of gossip coming from all directions. Mishra turned around at the sound of his brother's voice. They regarded each other. Mishra, beefy, tanned, weather-beaten. Urza, pale, white and lean. The brothers were reunited. After a long silence, Urza said, "It's good to see that you are well," and you could tell that he meant it. Mishra looked into his brother's eyes. "I'm well enough. And you?" Urza nodded and said, "I'm surprised to see that you're here with the Philologi." And Mishra came back with, "I'm not at all surprised to find you here with the Argivians." To which Urza said, "Actually, I'm here with the Yotians." "Ah, so that's why the Yotians have been raiding out into our desert." Urza looked a little annoyed as he said, "Brother, you know very well that Yotians don't raid, they explore." Mishra waved that away and said, "I serve his eminence, the Qadir now." There was an expectant pause after he said it, and it took Urza a moment to realize that it was his turn. "I'm now the chief artificer of Krug." Mishra said, "Oh, okay, and is that big metal man out there yours?" Again, Urza nodded. Mishra said, "I can see the Su-Chi design in the knees." Urza went on to explain how he's married now to a princess, and then afterwards, since he had seen Mishra with that red-headed woman, he asked if Ashnod was Mishra's wife. Mishra looked uncomfortable with the fact that his brother was married to a princess, but he clarified that Ashnod was his apprentice. Urza said, "I have an apprentice too, and 20 students as well. We have a school set up." Mishra got colder at this point. "You're doing quite well, it seems." Urza didn't pick up on the tone. "And you, brother, do you have a school?" "No, I live in the desert. We have no such luxuries." Urza turned and motioned to the giant brass dragon engine. "That is a marvel. It's unlike any of the Thran relics that we've uncovered in the past. Where did you come by it? Mishra said, I was out in the desert. I had a hunch, and it just came to me. He said it with a really big smile on his face. Urza smiled back. Maybe later you can tell me the story and show it off as well. I've made some significant changes to our original ornithopter designs, and I would really love to show them to you. Mishra's tone softened, and he looked at Urza and said, I'd like that. Perhaps we'll have time after this conference. Urza went to leave, but then turned back. It's good to see you again, brother. And you. And then the two brothers parted ways. An uneasy peace settled between them. Well, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this extra long installment of the Brothers War lore. If you like what we're doing here, then consider supporting us on Patreon. A big thank you to all of our patrons. We'll see you for the next episode. And remember, my friends, lore is life.